Hello, today's video is another entry in the series of interviews I'm doing to help publicize the 2022 conference of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. The conference is known as CSICon, and it'll take place in Las Vegas from October 20th to the 23rd, as you can see over my shoulder. Professor Naomi Oreskes is one of the speakers scheduled to appear at CSICon this year, and I'm happy to be able to talk with her today. Welcome, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
For any viewers who don't know who you are, let me fill them in. So I'll read your bio from the CSICon website. It says that you are the Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science and affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. And you're the internationally renowned earth scientist, historian, and author of both scholarly and popular books and articles on the history of Earth, environmental science, and including, most recently, Why Trust Science, and also Science on a Mission, How Military Funding Shaped What We Do and Don't Know About the Ocean. The book I'm most familiar with that you wrote is not there, 2010's Merchant of Doubt, which, by the way, somewhat instrumental in me changing my mind on climate change quite a bit after you wrote that, by the way.
Glad to hear that it was instrumental and change your mind. Sad that it took a while after it was published, but that's okay. Better late than never.
Also, you're a fellow of CSI, I believe, right?
I am.
And on top of all that, I just heard you were nominated for the World's Top Thinkers of 2022. Take that, Richard Wiseman, who wasn't even on the list I saw. But
well,
Elon Musk was, so
nice to be acknowledged, whether I get elected or not.
So I'd like to first talk about your CSICon appearance. Your talk is called "Can Science Be Saved?" All right, and it's scheduled for Friday at noon, and it's a very serious topic indeed. These are the excerpts of the talk's description from the website. In recent years, public debates about the validity of scientific findings and the value of science have intensified, as some Americans have actively resisted and even denied the legitimacy of scientific guidance about how to address the disease. How do we evaluate the role of facts, of political affinity, and of personal identity in the rejection of scientific advice? According to Naomi Oreskes, most people who reject science won't be persuaded with more technical facts. They deny scientific findings because they do not like the implications of the veracity, which you have called implicatory denial. Am I pronouncing that word right?
Yeah.
However, addressing those perceived implications and answering the concerns or fears involved can help us to make progress. This holds true in a range of domains, from COVID-19 to climate change. So first, the title, does science need saving? I mean, that sounds serious. Is that the thrust of your talk? Is there evidence it does? Or is that kind of like a what's it called, clickbait thing?
Well, okay, it's slightly clickbaitish in the sense that many people in the scientific community are worried that there's a crisis in science. So it is clickbait to extent, but it's actually not my clickbait. It actually came from like articles in Nature and Science and other important scientific publications. So a lot of people in the scientific community think there's a crisis in science, and they feel that way because they see the large numbers of Americans who have not become vaccinated against COVID-19, or the way in which political leaders misrepresented scientific evidence about masking, or the widespread rejection of the reality and severity of climate change among political leaders of a certain party that I won't mention. But the point of my talk is actually to have a slightly more nuanced view of the situation. So I argue that actually science overall is doing very well. Funding for science remains high. Public support of science is broadly high. Actually, support of science is much higher than many other institutions. So about 70% of Americans say they broadly think that science, well, it depends, like a lot of surveys, depends exactly how you
ask the question.
But basically more good than bad, and tend to trust science and scientific leaders far more, for example, than journalists, politicians, business leaders. So overall, the state of science is actually quite healthy, and it is really important for us to recognize that, because if we don't accurately diagnose the problem, then we won't get good solutions. But that said, there are some significant problems, as we all know, because as we've seen, there's been significant resistance to vaccination among a significant portion of the American population and among a significant portion of American political leadership. And this really matters, not just because those people put their own health at stake, because I think many of us could argue, if it were just about their own lives, then we could say it's a personal choice. but it affects us all. When people don't get vaccinated, they spread the disease to other people, and those other people may die. So we're not just talking about an inconvenience, we're talking about matters of life and death. And the same is true for climate change, which is the issue that I've studied most closely. You might want to say, well, look, it's up to you. If you want to buy an electric car, good for you, but I'm going to stick with my old gas guzzler. But the problem with that argument is that it affects everyone else. And this year in particular, we have seen the way climate change is affecting the whole globe, droughts, wildfires. And again, these aren't simply inconveniences. These are in many cases life-threatening, home-threatening, community-threatening developments. And we know that they're caused by human activities, burning fossil fuels, and deforestation. And so if we don't address those issues, then we won't be able to solve the problem. And so that's what I'm interested in. Why is it that even though the scientific evidence of climate change is overwhelming, and it has been for a long time, and the predictions of scientists have come true, or why even someone like yourself, why did it take until years after my book, which was written, well, let me just think for a second, about 15 years after the scientific community had come to consensus that climate change was real and threatening, why has it taken so many people so long to accept that? And my argument is it's not because the science is bad science, it's not because the science was so uncertain, it really wasn't, but because there are other things that factor how we think about scientific evidence. And we need to pay attention to those other factors if we want people to understand the science, accept scientific findings, and have rational and reasoned discussions about what to do about these problems.
So as I stumbled over the phrase in the opening, implicatory denial, can you describe what, I hadn't heard that phrase. What
Sure.
What does that mean? What does that have? How does that jive with the typical denial people hear about, science denial?
Right. So I don't know, I pronounce it implicatory, but it could be implicatory. I don't know if there's an official correct definition, pronunciation. But what I mean by that is that if you look closely at people who reject scientific findings, what you find in almost every single case is that what they're really upset about are the implications. So for example, evolutionary theory is an area that's been very well studied. People who reject evolutionary theory don't reject it because it doesn't have a persuasive account of the origin of species. They reject it because they think it challenges their religious worldview. So many people who reject evolutionary theory think it means that there's no God, or they think it means that life is random. So they confuse the randomness of mutation with a claim about the randomness of life, which is not the same thing. Or they think that the randomness of mutation means that life is meaningless. And so you will see many creationists will, in their writings, will say things, well, evolutionary theory tells me that human life is meaningless, and I don't believe that, so therefore I reject evolutionary theory. Well, this is a mistake, right? Because evolutionary theory doesn't tell us that life is meaningless, and it doesn't disprove.
It has nothing to do with that.
Correct, exactly. Actually has nothing to do with that. And it doesn't disprove the existence of God. But sometimes scientists speak as if it might have something to do with that. And sometimes our scientific colleagues, in their enthusiasm to defend evolutionary theory, do in fact say things that are insulting to people of faith. So part of my argument is that if you understand implicatory denial, that is to say, if you understand what people are worried about, then you realize that in many cases you can address it just as you just did this moment to say, well, actually, our evolutionary theory has nothing to do with the meaning of life. These are two really different questions. And you can accept evolutionary theory, accept that people, along with plants and animals and fungi and bacteria, have all evolved, and yet still find deep and profound meaning in life, and still accept the idea that there could be a creator who's ultimately responsible for it.
Yeah, I know some religious people in my personal life who are in their particular religious bubble, and they believe every Christian does not believe in evolution. And if I point out the Catholic Church has accepted this for decades, and they're the largest Christian denomination there is, they just don't even believe me.
Right. So that's a beautiful example of implicatory denial, because they not only deny evolutionary theory, but they actually deny the facts about what people think about evolutionary theory. And so this is something that we've now seen become widespread in American culture. And so it's not that science itself is in crisis, but there is a crisis of belief about institutional authority and factual evidence that is really, really consequential for science. And that's what I'm hoping that the audience at CSI will be interested in thinking about, because I do feel, and here's where I'll be a little bit provocative, that some of my good colleagues at CSI have sometimes said things that don't help.
So another thing I hear a lot is, well, science doesn't know what it's talking about because it's always changing its mind.
Yeah, that drives me totally insane. Because no one who says that actually knows anything about science, because actually it's not true. Science is a highly deliberative process. It generally takes a long time for scientists to come to consensus on complicated issues. And scientists, in fact, don't change their minds very readily, often have a very high bar, a very skeptical bar for what it takes to change our views about the natural world. But it is the case that many science deniers, science rejectors will use this argument. They'll say, oh, they're always changing their mind. And often the examples they use, well, I became curious about this because people would say this in talks that I gave. And so I would often ask my interlocutor, so what example are you thinking of? I can tell you that 3 times out of 4, they had no example. They just had this impression because they'd heard this accusation made. So it isn't true that scientists are always changing their mind. But if they did have an example, it was almost always from nutrition. Well, I think we know something about nutrition. Nutrition is a very difficult science because people lie about what they eat, and because you can't do experiments on people, and because you can't do double-blind randomized clinical trials. So it is difficult to get really good data on nutrition, but it's also the case that nutrition science is massively misreported in the media because food is something of great interest. There's a lot of clickbait surrounding dietary claims. And it's also true that the food industry has propagated a lot of disinformation. And so we're in a landscape about nutrition where it can appear that scientists are always changing their mind. But that's not actually true. But even if it were true, it wouldn't mean, even if nutrition were a complete morass, it wouldn't necessarily mean that that was true of all of science.
Yeah, right. Yeah, people extrapolate that. But yeah, nutrition is for sure. I mean, it's probably one of the least understood, well, besides maybe human psychology, because that's a problem too, also doing studies on people and understanding why people do what they do. Yeah, but nutrition, so influencers talk about something like, oh, I read this study and therefore, and people, well, it's science. And then that someone else comes along next year and says the opposite. Oh, see, science changed its mind. But really, science hadn't decided on that at all.
Exactly.
Yeah, so all right, how about the other part of the distrust in science, because purposeful disinformation is put out. And certainly that was a topic of your book that we mentioned.
Right. So as you said, a lot of my work, particularly my book, Emergence of Doubt, focuses on purposeful disinformation. People who want us to think that the science is unsettled, or want us to think that scientists are always changing our mind, or want us to think that scientists are taking away our freedom, because the reality is that science threatens their economic or political interests. And the clearest example of this that is most well documented and that we wrote about in Emergence of Doubt is the tobacco industry. So we know that going back to the 1950s, arguably even earlier, there was clear scientific evidence that tobacco is a deadly product, that it causes a whole host of disease, not just lung cancer, but heart disease, respiratory illness, a whole suite of different cancers besides lung cancer, even blindness. And this has been known for a long time. But starting in the 1950s, the tobacco industry organized a deliberate, conscious, and frankly conspiratorial organization or network. They were in fact found by law, by the courts, to have engaged in a conspiracy to commit fraud against the American people. So a deliberate conspiracy to make us think that the science was unsettled. It focused on science because their own market research showed them that if people believed that the science was clear and compelling, they would quit smoking, or at least they would try to quit. And one of the other things we know the tobacco industry did was to deliberately make their cigarettes more addictive by manipulating the nicotine
content.
Yeah. So this was an attempt to undermine people's capacity to act as individuals and stop smoking by confusing them about the science. And what we showed in Emergence of Doubt was that that same strategy was then applied in some cases by the same people and many of the same organizations, think tanks, public relations firms, advertising companies, to create doubt about other issues as well, including the reality of acid rain, which if your audience is old enough, they'll remember, the ozone hole, and climate change. And so this is a deliberate, as you said, purposeful strategy to make us doubt science so that we don't stop using these dangerous products. And one of the things that's most sad to me, and why I think it's of importance to this audience, is that in some cases we see that this has now spread to a deliberate attempt to generate distrust in all science, because science often points out the reality of dangerous products, the reality of the way in which using fossil fuels is hurting people. And, you know, there's a famous saying, your freedom to throw a punch stops at the end of my nose. Well, it's science that tells us where our nose is. It's science that even tells us what a nose is. So if you can undermine people's conception of the nose, metaphorically speaking, then the whole argument about the limits of your right to throw a punch gets very, very muddled. And that is what we have seen happen in the United States over the last half century or so.
I kind of see like a fundamental difference though, in a line drawn in like, you know, evil guys in the back room, or women too, deciding, well, I don't care if people die from lung cancer because there's no one I know, because I'm going to tell them the truth. But then if you're in an organization which is purposely effing up the planet, and you know that, and that's going to affect you and your kids and your grandkids and everyone, like how do they justify that?
Well, this is a great question. And of course, I get this question all the time. And what I say in response is that rationalization is a very, very powerful human modality. So what we see in their work, and we know the answer to this question because as historians, we get to read their letters and their publications and sometimes even their diaries. So they rationalize it, and they rationalize it in two ways. One is to say, well, you don't want the government deciding. So tobacco industry executives, even though they knew that their product was killing people, built this whole argument about the government, the nanny state, and that you didn't want the government telling you whether you could or couldn't smoke, because if they did, then the next thing you know, they would be telling you where you could live and what job you could have. So it's a kind of slippery slope argument. Today we regulate tobacco, tomorrow we lose all our freedom. And that argument, I believe, was made extremely cynically by tobacco executives. And we have pretty good evidence to support that interpretation. But, and one of the things we know also is that tobacco executives hid this from their own employees. So there are several memos we came across where they say things like, we have to make sure that the salesmen don't know this, right? Because they were worried that if the salesmen did know, that they would start quitting in droves. But then there's an additional component, which I think is not so much, you know, the evil genius in the back room, but a more widespread phenomenon, and in that sense, actually more worrisome. This argument about freedom then gets taken up by libertarian and conservative think tanks in the United States, groups like the Cato Institute or the American Enterprise Institute or the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And here I think it's more subtle. So many of these organizations advocate limited government and personal freedom. They're highly, have a highly individualistic worldview. And I think many of the people who hold that view hold it authentically. They believe a world where individuals get to choose for themselves is authentically a better world than a world where the government tells us what to do. And I sympathize with that argument up to a point, right? I don't want the government telling me what to do either. But because they believe this so deeply and so sincerely, they may not lie about the science, but they're very reluctant to accept science that would challenge that view, that would say, well, yeah, limited government's good in principle, but when the tobacco industry is selling a product that's killing people, that's when you need government regulation in the marketplace. Or when the fossil fuel industry is selling a product that is disrupting the entire climate system in ways that is threatening our food supply, that's when the government needs to intervene. And so many of these people have a lot of trouble accepting that because it basically argues that their philosophical worldview or their political worldview, it's kind of coming up against some pretty big roadblocks. And so what you see from these folks is not outright lying. I think that's pretty rare, but a lot of, I don't really believe it. I'm skeptical. I think it's exaggerated. I think scientists are exaggerating the threat. And they use the term skepticism to describe their position, but it isn't really skepticism because a true skeptic demands evidence, and we have enormous amounts of evidence. So this is not just skepticism. This is something that goes beyond skepticism into a kind of resistance to scientific findings that would disrupt their worldview.
Now, what do you see as the differing roles, or maybe they're similar or complementary, regarding historians and scientists and science communicators and skeptical activists in this regard?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think the proper role for a skeptical activist is to say, okay, well, we accept the science, but we want to discuss what the policy options are. We don't want to just jump right away to a government-led solution because maybe there might be other solutions, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if tobacco weren't addictive, I would probably be sympathetic to the idea that we give people good information, they could decide for themselves whether to smoke or not. But so a healthy skepticism would be to accept the evidence, the science, and say, okay, let's have an open and informed debate about what to do about it. But that's, of course, not what's happened in this country. What we've seen instead is this massive rejection of scientific evidence on the part of people on the right wing of the political spectrum. In terms of scientists, the key take home for scientists is that for a long time, I think this has changed now, but it certainly was true when I first started working in this area. Many scientists thought that climate denial or climate rejection, climate science rejection, was driven by lack of understanding of the science. So if they just explained the science better, gave people more facts, that would persuade them. Well, we know that's not true. We've seen that it doesn't work because it's really not about the facts. It's about these implications. And so you have to address the implications if you want to open up a space for a conversation with people. And it doesn't work to insult their religious worldview, but it might work to say, look, evolutionary theory doesn't disprove God. No science can do that because the existence of God is not a scientific question. For science communicators, it's something similar, right? That it's not enough simply to throw facts at people or to accuse them of being stupid, but to try to understand why they're resistant to accepting this factual information. And if you can get into a conversation about that, then again, you can open up a space for dialogue. And then for historians, well, you know, I think the role that I've been able to play here is to understand the social and historical context of these debates, because the scientists are busy doing science. I mean, one thing I learned when I started writing Merchants of Doubt, it wasn't that no scientist knew that these things were happening. Many climate scientists did know because they had seen it or because they had been the victim of attacks, but they were scientists and they wanted to do science, which is their job and what they're trained for. And so their response was just to go back and do more science, better science, to try to reduce the uncertainties, to try to make the scientific case that much more rock solid, bulletproof. And of course, that didn't work because that wasn't what it was really about. So for me as a historian, I was able to step back and ask the question, well, why are these people rejecting the science in the first place? This is very robust science. Science has been working for a long time. It's not a fad. Many of these scientific predictions have come true. So we see the high quality of the science. And yet people are not only saying, well, I'm skeptical, people were in outright denial and rejection of the science, and people were attacking the scientists. And so that became clear to me there was some larger cultural effect going on. And as a historian, I was trained to think about larger cultural patterns and effects. And so I was able to engage into this topic in a way that most of the climate scientists were really not prepared to do.
Yeah, so I happen to know someone with a PhD in history of science working at the University of Oklahoma. Hello, Joanne.
Oh,
And she wanted me to ask you a few questions from the perspective of someone else in the same field.
sure.
So she said, when journalists look for experts on public health issues, they reach out to scientists and medical doctors, but these folks aren't always up on the history of science or medicine. Do you think this is a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can even generalize it a bit. In general, journalists tend not to be very sensitive to what I call proximate expertise, which is to say, who are the real experts here? Who really knows what is and isn't happening in this area? And so this is part of what the Merchants of Doubt played on. So the original Merchants of Doubt, who we wrote about in our book, Merchants of Doubt, were physicists, nuclear physicists. They were rocket scientists. They were people who had built Cold War weapons programs. They were not climate scientists. They were not oncologists. They were not atmospheric chemists. And yet they presented themselves. They used the authority of their scientific position to present themselves as experts. And because they were genuinely scientists, the media fell for it, lock, stock, and barrel. And so they were very, very frequently quoted in the press, even though they actually had little or no expertise in many of the areas they were speaking on. So I think journalists need to be a little bit more discerning about what kind of expert is relevant in this particular case, and to think about that a little bit more before they just turn to their, well, I guess people don't have Rolodexes anymore, but turn to their metaphor, their digital Rolodex.
Their contact lists.
They're contactless, right. Now, when it comes to public health, that's a great example because, of course, public health isn't just about science. And we've known this for a long time. Public health also involves how the public respond to scientific remedies, how they respond to vaccination, how they respond to quarantine. And there's a large history of this, which historians of medicine and public health have written about at great length. So anyone who knew anything about that history could have predicted, and in fact, many of us did predict, that we would have a crisis, even if a vaccine, even if a highly safe and effective vaccine were offered, that there would be many people who would be reluctant to accept it. And you could have asked any historian of medicine, any historian of public health, you could have asked me, and it's not even my specialty, back in January or February of 2020, and we would have told you this because it's very well known historically. But that's not who the press went to, right? The press went to the virologists, the immunologists, with this idea that they were the experts. And it's true, they were experts on a portion of the problem, but public health is never just about the pathogen. It's always also about the larger cultural and social trends. And if we had thought through those trends in a more effective way, if the CDC, for example, had a team of historians working with the immunologists, I think we could have prepared a better rollout of the vaccine. It doesn't mean everyone would have accepted it, they wouldn't have, but I think that some of the concerns of some of the people could have been lessened. And we also could have addressed, some of vaccine resistance isn't really vaccine resistance, it's people not having a day off from work, or people worried that they don't have sick leave, so if the vaccine makes them sick. And some of those concerns could have been addressed, or at least reduced with Saturday clinics or whatever. But again, you'd have to have that conversation to be able to think through what would be appropriate remedies. And in many parts of the country, that discussion never happened.
Also, the initial masking, mandates and rules. I have friends who, like 6 months into the pandemic, were like saying, Rob, masks don't work. I heard it from the CDC. Why? And then they would, it's like trying to prevent mosquitoes getting into your backyard by putting up a chain link fence.
Right. Well, that's where the communication piece comes in. So I don't like to criticize scientists because in general, in the world I work in, scientists are the victims, not the perpetrators. But that's a case where the scientific community truly made a hash of the communication, right?
Yeah.
Because, and again, where the history could have helped, because it is true that if the question was, will masking prevent the spread of this particular new novel virus? It is true that, say, back in December of 2019, no one could answer that question scientifically because this virus had not yet been well studied. But if you step back from that and say, well, what do we know about respiratory viruses in general? What do we know about previous respiratory pandemics? Then you could have said, well, we don't know for sure, but we have good reason to believe that masking will help slow the spread. And if people had said that, I think, again, it wouldn't have solved all our problems, but it would have solved some of them for sure. And then the other part of it, the World Health Organization knew right from the get-go that masking probably would work, but they were petrified that people would go out and hoard them. And so they told people not to wear masks. And some people at World Health Organization even said masks don't work. Well, that was a colossal error, both factual and strategic, because well, it created this impression that scientists were changing their minds when a couple of months later they said, oh, masks do work. But also it was dishonest, because if your real concern is hoarding, then to say, oh, don't buy masks because they don't work, but that's not actually what you really think. It's condescending, it's dishonest. And of course, people are going to be annoyed and frustrated and angry if they feel they're being lied to. So my view is lying is not a good strategy. And it's especially not a good strategy when you're presenting yourself as a truth-telling enterprise.
So my experience on not only climate change when I was on the other side of the fence, but also the whole masks don't work or who needs a vaccine is very dependent on your social network, the social media you follow, the bubbles that you're in. So what do you think about the influence of that ideology leading people to be in these bubbles, especially with social media the last 20 years it's been in existence, I guess, supporting what they already believe, and how do we get out of this?
Right. Well, again, this is where other branches of science, social science, psychology, history can be helpful. So it should not have come as a surprise to anyone, although it did come as a surprise to many people, that humans are tribal. and that we're social animals and we're deeply influenced by the people around, what the people around us think. It's been well established for a long time in communication science, what's known as the trusted messenger effect. People don't just judge the message, they also judge the messenger. And so if you have a community that you know is somewhat skeptical towards scientific authority for whatever reason, religious, political, class, race, whatever, then it's really important to think about who your messengers are. And so, for example, one thing that studies show is nurses are very, very trusted. They're trusted more than doctors in many communities. So it might have been more effective if instead of trotting out a bunch of mostly white male doctors, if more nurses had been enlisted in communication strategies, particularly nurses who represented a variety of ranges of sizes, shapes, colors, heights, religious affiliation, because then you could have increased the odds that people would be hearing a message from a trusted messenger. And again, none of this is new to people in the social sciences, but because people in the natural sciences, particularly, in immunology or virology, have paid scant attention to these kinds of issues, there were some really major missed opportunities.
So I want to ask you about a film. It was produced by Netflix, I believe, 6 months ago or so, maybe 7. It was released, Don't Look Up, right? It was an apocalyptic satire. And for those who don't know about it, it's about 2 astronomers attempting to warn humanity that a comet is going to hit the Earth and destroy civilization. And it's a satire because it shows like total disinterest in the media and the population and the politicians, ignoring this threat, which is going to happen. So while watching it, I took it as a parody of insufficient reaction to the COVID pandemic. And then later on, I read that, no, the script predated the pandemic, and it was really an allegory for inaction on climate change. So, that was kind of interesting. I have to go back and watch it someday with that in mind. Per Wikipedia, numerous climate scientists and science communicators offered positive opinions on the film, in quotes. Climate policy expert Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson wrote an op-ed in The Guardian advocating for the value of humor and promoting action on climate change. And Michael Mann called it a serious social-political commentary, posing as comedy. So have you commented on the film? What do you think?
Well, I may have commented on it if I got asked. I didn't write any pieces about it. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. So I think that a lot of climate scientists are so desperate at this point. They've tried so many ways to reach the American people and have come across so many roadblocks that the idea that there would be a Hollywood movie that would be kind of a game changer, and particularly if it was humorous, because we know you can reach people with humor sometimes when you can't reach them any other way. I think like a lot of climate scientists got really excited and really hopeful that this film would be a game changer. It wasn't. It was a pretty good film. It was funny. I liked it. I didn't expect to like it. I thought I wouldn't like it because it reminded me a little bit of, did you ever see the film Thank You for Smoking?
No.
That was a similar satire about what the tobacco industry had done. And years ago, when I first started working on this, so many people said, oh, you have to watch this movie. And frankly, it was really painful for me to watch because I couldn't laugh at it because it was so close to the truth. So I thought Don't Look Up would be like that. Maybe I'm more relaxed now. I did find it funny. I did laugh, and I actually thought it was better than I expected. And I thought the ending was actually amazing and courageous.
You watched the end credit scenes, right? A lot of people
Yeah,
do.
totally. Yeah, and I don't want no spoiler alerts,
Yeah.
but I'll just say I thought the ending was actually quite amazing and very, very courageous, and very well acted. But the reality again is that people are so locked in and so entrenched in their views now that the idea that a movie, particularly a Hollywood movie produced by an actor who's known for his support of left-wing and liberal causes, the idea that that would really move the needle among conservatives who are kind of really locked into an anti-climate science position, I think that was a little bit overly optimistic. So I think this outpouring of scientific support for the film was kind of scientists' way of saying, we really want this film to reach people and we really want this film to change people's minds. But I haven't seen any data, so I don't know for sure, but my guess is that it probably didn't actually change very many minds.
And the question would be, what would it have changed minds on? Because like, I think because of the release timing, it was like about the pandemic. And then the question would be, did it change people's mind on how they reacted to that as opposed to climate change?
Yeah, and I don't know if good, now that said, there is some interesting research that was done on the film An Inconvenient Truth, and that film did change a lot of people's minds, and studies showed that after seeing the film, people were much more likely to feel that climate change was a serious issue and that they personally should become engaged in trying to do something about it. And we know that because a lot of research was done on it, but also because the purposeful disinformation about climate change went into major high gear after that film came out, because they thought that it was very persuasive. And so they did everything they could to undermine it. And it was after that film that the attacks on Al Gore as a person really ramped up.
I remember
So this
that.
is the other thing that we have to take account of, that when people do manage to come out with a communication strategy that is effective, the purveyors of purposeful disinformation are ready and forced to counter it.
Yeah, so you mentioned one of the earlier questions, the conspiracy, the actual conspiracy in the tobacco industry. And so then there's this question about how much does conspiratorial thinking impact the trust in science? And because there are real conspiracies, like how do people know what's a made up conspiracy theory versus a real conspiracy that actually happened or is happening?
Exactly. And this is why this is really tricky territory, because as you just said, and I've said many times, sometimes there really are conspiracies. So then the question becomes evidence. What is the evidence to support the idea? And in the case of tobacco, we have millions of pages of documents, in part because the tobacco industry was prosecuted, was brought to court, both in civil cases on the state level and on the level of the federal government. We have this enormous documentary evidence to show that they actually did engage in a conspiracy to commit fraud against the American people. Most of the things that go by the term conspiracy theories, we don't have evidence of. And so one of the arguments that I make is that science is really not so much about theories, but it's about evidence. You can have a theory about almost anything. And in general, science mostly is and should be fairly open-minded to different forms of theoretical explanation of phenomenon. But what makes something scientific is the demand for evidence. And that's where the healthy skepticism comes in. So someone has a theory about, I don't know, let's say the paranormal, because that's a favorite topic of skeptical inquiry, right? It's okay for them to have the theory, but then we have the right to say, well, where's the evidence? And if you repeatedly do experiments that fail to provide evidence, and at some point you say, okay, well, come back when you've got some evidence. And that is the scientific approach, not to reject something a priori, but to reject it when there's no evidence to support it. And so many of the things that go by the name of conspiracy theory on the internet are claims that have no empirical support. Sometimes they're also claims that fly in the face of large amounts of evidence to the contrary. And sometimes they're claims that simply fly in the face of what we believe we know from science about the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, those sorts of things, right? And so, we often talk in this space about magic. Obviously, one reason why people love magic is because it appears to violate the laws of gravity or other laws. We know that it's not really true, but that's sort of what makes it fun as a form of entertainment. But if we were to blur the boundary between entertainment and genuine belief, which does in fact happen on the internet, that's when we get into trouble.
Right. Okay, so back to CSICon for a few final questions. So have you attended any conferences like this in the past? I mean,
No, I
I know you
haven't.
academic conferences all the time.
Oh, no, I've been invited many times and it's never, my schedule has never permitted me to attend. So I'm excited that this year, finally, I am able to attend.
Okay, thank you for your time today.
You're
It
welcome.
was great to be able to record this talk for my Skeptical Inquirer readers and anyone else who stumbles upon it on the interwebs afterwards. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.